Boldwood presents The Accused, written by Owen Mullen and read by Angus King. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Inside the restaurant in Merchant City, people recognised the handsome couple and whispered to each other behind their hands. Tomorrow, they'd have a story to tell. Sean Rafferty lifted his head in time to catch the half-smile fade from his wife's lips. Something had amused her. Across the table, Kim nervously pushed food around the plate, knowing his eyes were on her. Rafferty turned in his seat and saw a guy in his mid-30s leaning back in his chair, swirling the red wine in his glass. Through his designer stubble, he was smiling too. On another day, this was a good enough excuse for Sean to drag him outside and beat him senseless. Except that was the old Sean Rafferty. A PR company was charging him a small fortune to make his family's violent past ancient history. He dabbed the edges of his mouth with a napkin. "Want to let me in on the joke?" Kim said, "What joke? There isn't a joke." "Your friend seems to think there is." She put down her cutlery, annoyed by the accusation. "I've no idea what you're talking about. What friend?" "You fucking slut. Do you think I'm a fool?" "I was only being polite, Sean." He snapped his fingers impatiently in the air for the bill. The evening was over. In the taxi on the way home, he didn't speak. When they got to the house in Bothwell on the banks of the River Clyde, Kim ran upstairs and locked the bedroom door. Rafferty paid the driver and asked him to take the babysitter home. Inside, he peeled money off the wad in his pocket and gave it to the young teenager who looked after Rosie when they went out. Then he went upstairs. His shoulder connected with the wooden door panel. Kim screamed, and he stepped into the room. Part 1. Chapter 1. Sean Rafferty was in a foul mood. He didn't need this shit. Behind the wheel of the midnight blue Mercedes, the driver kept his mouth shut. He knew better. In the passenger seat, Sean slouched, sullen and silent, as they joined the motorway and the procession into the city. This morning, the face staring back at him from the bathroom mirror was no longer a young man's face. The skin around the eyes dry and puffy above the dark shadow in his jaw. A reminder of his father in his last years after the stroke doused the spark, leaving him crippled and bitter and, if it was possible, even more of a vicious old bastard than he'd been. Sean had splashed cold water on his cheeks, put drops in his bloodshot whites, and studied his reflection again. Better, though not much. He was getting older. Simple as that. It happened to everybody. Today he felt it, and last night hadn't helped. The idiot at the next table in the restaurant had been on his second bottle of wine and hadn't bothered to hide his lust, staring at Kim, smiling, mouthing words at her when he thought Rafferty wasn't looking. Sean understood those words. He'd whispered them to other men's wives and savoured their reaction. It had taken every ounce of self-restraint not to stab the man in the eye with a fork. No point spending a small fortune cleaning up his image to spoil it on some drunken horny clown who fancied his chances. The guy would never know how lucky he'd been. Kim was another story. There were no excuses for her. She could have shut it down. Instead, she'd preferred to make a fool of him and join in the game. When would this silly bitch learn? The answer was obvious. Never. And it couldn't have mattered less. She'd served her purpose and given him a daughter. Sex? Okay rather than great. Hadn't lasted beyond the 3rd year. Kim would have been down the road already. Except Rosie adored her mummy. Now, she'd gone past her sell-by date. Time to trade her in for a newer model. One with a bit of fire under the bonnet. Of course, she thawed quick enough when her credit card was maxed out or she needed money for a new obsession. There have been plenty of those. For a while, Ayurvedic massage. Then a series of sessions in a flotation tank in an Edinburgh spa. Christ knew what that was supposed to be about. Colonic hydrotherapy was a latest. The breakdown in communication meant he was spared the details, for which he was grateful. The back of his skull throbbed in rhythm with his heart. He'd sat in the conservatory and hammered a bottle of Ballantine's till stupid o'clock. In his youth, he'd binge for 3 days and need a day to recover. Now, it was the other way around. A quack would shake his head and, with a superior smile, deliver a bleak prognosis. Cut down on the booze or suffer the consequences. Sean Rafferty's response would be the same as many in the west of Scotland. No chance. The previous night, Kim had locked herself in the bedroom. It hadn't saved the bitch, but a decision on his marital situation was overdue. He'd been tying a Windsor knot in the blue Salvatore Ferragamo around his neck when the call from Vicky had come through. Sean? Yeah. Problem at Downhill? Fuck. One of our girls is at the Royal Infirmary. He'd bidden back his irritation. Vicky Farrell was worth 2 of anybody else in the payroll. If she was contacting him this early, there had to be more to it. How bad? She'll be out of action for a few weeks. Handle it, Victoria. Isn't that what I pay you for? It's not that simple. The guy who did it says you work for his father. Sean had felt the anger that was never far away stir in him. I work for... What's this fucker's name? Hunter. Kelvin Hunter. His father is... I know who his father is. They pulled up at a set of traffic lights on Park Road with the spire of Lansdowne Parish Church rising slim and stark into a cold blue sky. Rafferty's fingers drummed impatiently on his thigh, while dull-eyed pedestrians crossed in front of them on their way to another soul-destroying shift in the snake pits. The fool he was going to meet claimed Sean worked for his father, which wasn't even close to being true. Apart from old Jimmy, Sean had never worked for anybody. He tried to imagine what it would be like and failed. It seemed Bryce Hunter had been building up his part, boasting to his maladjusted offspring what a big shot he was. Apparently, being an influential member of 3 committees and chairman of another wasn't enough for him. Whining and dining city planners, slipping brown envelopes under the table while Sean had to fake interest in their long-winded stories was one thing. Letting their over-entitled spawn take liberties with his girls was a stretch too far. Sean's father and brother were dead. Their criminal enterprise, the scourge of the East End for close on half a century, hadn't died with them. Sean had taken over. But his vision of the future was very different. Times had changed. The old ways were gone. He put people in charge of running the streets. Vicky Farrell was one of them, while he faded into the background, engaged a PR company to create his new image, and got involved in well-publicised causes like the one this morning. Life had never been better. Other than his bitch of a wife, he'd little to complain about. In a few short years, he'd become one of the most respected members of the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce and the driving force behind a much-lauded initiative to provide shelter for the city's many homeless. Rafferty's role model wasn't his crude, unsophisticated father, who'd punched and gouged his way to the top of the Glasgow underworld. His son had rubbed up against another kind of man and wanted to be like him. He'd visited Emil Roca's villa, seen how the Spaniard lived, and wanted the same. The drug lord supplied Sean's organisation, but their association went deeper. Unbeknown to the city council, one of Europe's biggest criminals was Rafferty's sleeping partner in the Waterside Regeneration Initiative, the prestigious multi-million-pound development on the Clyde. Sean's brainchild slogan, "Good for Glasgow," had helped sway public opinion and overcome objections to the controversial project. Roca was happy having a finger in yet another pie, and was coming to Glasgow ostensibly to take a look at what his money had helped build. In reality, and Sean Rafferty knew it, he was checking up on his Scottish connection. The truth about how Rafferty's fledgling company came to partner Glasgow City Council would never be known. It hadn't made him rich, although he was well on the way, but it sealed the deal on his new persona. And like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, Sean Rafferty was reborn and reinvented. To a gullible world, a public-spirited, self-made entrepreneur who just happened to buy his Ludovic de Saint-Sernin suits from 5 Carlos Place in Mayfair, rather than Ralph Slater in Howard Street, a stone's throw from the river. The expensive clothes changed nothing. Hidden beneath the facade of do-good sham respectability was the pitiless gangster he'd always been. Unmistakably, his father's son. Marrying Kim completed the picture he wanted to promote. Love hadn't come into it. She'd given him Rosie, his daughter, and another piece of the image was in place. Today was a busy day. Places to go and people to see. A meeting with his accountant scheduled for 9:30 had been pushed back because of Vicky's call. Then a visit to the youth centre in Rutherglen he'd championed, built on a parcel of land until recently a designated greenbelt. Making Glasgow better was his new rallying cry as he moved among the disadvantaged, who mistakenly saw him as one of their own. Not everybody was convinced by the gangster as a Renaissance man. Once again, the Herald had several pieces questioning the probity of the planning permission process, among other things, stopping short of saying money had changed hands. Fuck them. If they'd proof, they'd be shouting it from their rooftops. They hadn't, and weren't likely to find anyone brave enough to corroborate their suspicions. He pulled his thoughts back to Rosie. Rafferty liked to give the little girl a kiss before he left, and the omission today annoyed him. He blamed Kim and made a promise to himself to call his lawyer to start divorce proceedings. His pounding head promoted another thought. Might as well tone the drinking down while he was at it. Always assuming he could. Beginning tomorrow, of course. Sean had no regrets about his violence the night before. Kim had got what she deserved. His mind wandered to the solicitor's wife he was meeting later, picturing her naked. They'd met at his place, at a party organised by Kim. A tedious affair, weren't they all? His leggy guest had made her intentions clear early on, running a hand down her thigh to straighten her skirt when she knew he was watching, her eyes on him longer than necessary. A prelude to sex. She wanted him. Who was he to deny her? Given the chance, he'd have taken her to one of the spare rooms. God knew there were enough of them, and done her there and then. Kim had sensed something, and glued herself to his elbow for the rest of the night. When everybody left, she stormed upstairs and locked the bedroom door. Her locking the door always amused Sean. His lips cracked in a half-smile, there and gone. Last night he'd shown her nothing would stop him if he wanted to come in. To hell with her. The woman today would be good. He knew she'd be good. The married ones were always the best. Playing golf with Guy, Her smug tit of a solicitor husband added piquancy to the conquest. Rafferty imagined Guy thrashing between her spread legs, convinced he was the only one who'd been there. Secrets. Everybody had them. The only people who didn't were 6 feet under. They crossed Byres Road and Queen Margaret Drive, past the contrasting iconic facades of the Hilton Glasgow Grosvenor Hotel in one corner and Moor, the brasserie in the former Kelvinside Parish Church. Another fucking church on the other. Whoever had spotted that opening should be congratulated. A gold mine if ever there was one. Capitalising on opportunities was the name of the game. Business in the morning, other men's wives in the afternoon. Before that, he had this crap to deal with. A left turn then, further on, a right brought them into an elegant Grade B listed sandstone terrace lined with parked cars. They rolled to a halt, and Rafferty got out. He had 2 more properties like the one he was about to visit, in Mount Florida, a spit from Hampden Park, and in Crown Circus, all bringing in coin. Short of another ice age, property was the most solid investment you could make. He didn't own the houses, at least not yet. The banks did. Eventually he would. For the moment, horny men paid the mortgages, and Vicky Farrell managed them. Vicky waited inside the door. Her and Sean went way back. Once upon a time he'd been her best customer, using her as much as 3 times a week. A rough lover with strong hands who'd suck her nipples until they were swollen and tender, then take her from behind. He was never satisfied. When she thought he'd finished, he'd mount her again in a different position. Sean Rafferty liked to get his money's worth, and it was okay with her. He was handsome and firm and knew his way around a woman's body. Faking orgasms to placate the fragile egos of inadequate men was Vicky Farrell's trade. With Sean, she'd had no need. When he married a size 6 model with Botox lips, Vicky hadn't expected to see him again. And then one day, her mobile rang. It was Sean, offering her a job. Vicky accepted, and they'd sealed it with a fuck for old time's sake, knowing it was a one-off. But he made clear the history between them, however sweet, counted for nothing. Protecting his investment was her responsibility, which meant making sure the girls maximised their potential as revenue streams on legs. That wasn't always easy. The smarter ones stayed clear of drugs and disease, saved their pennies and got out as soon as they could. Some even found a man and put the skin trade behind them. It happened they were the exceptions. Most hung on too long, lost their youth and their looks, and moved down the chain, through the brothels and, eventually, onto the street. By then, nobody cared if they lived or died or how they abused their bodies. Not even then. Chapter 2. Vicky saw the anger in Sean's eyes and blanched. He strode into the flat without looking at her and spoke out of the side of his mouth. "Where is he?" Quietly, and all the more chilling for it. "The last door on the left." She fell into step with him down the hall. He didn't ask about the girl who'd been injured. She was a stranger to him and always would be. They'd never meet, never speak. Somebody he could profit from until her usefulness came to an end. Vicky volunteered the information anyway. "She's okay." "Who is?" "Our girl. The attack wasn't as vicious as it might have been. He wasn't trying to kill her, just hurt her for fun, because he could. Fortunately, one of the others heard her screaming and called me." "When was this?" "Around 3. We caught the bastard running down Great Western and brought him back." "Why didn't you sort him there and then?" "Oh, I wanted to, believe me, Sean. This is the 2nd time he's roughed up our girls. Left the last one unconscious on the pavement in West George Street. He was getting a hiding until he said you worked for his father. He wasn't scared. Or bothered about the damage he'd done, so I phoned you. Rafferty stopped at the end of the hall. How long have you known me, Victoria? He called her Victoria when he was displeased. A long time. And have I ever mentioned working for anybody? I mean, even once? No. So why take this clown's word when you know it isn't true? What if it was? I couldn't be certain. You're involved in so many things. Rafferty shook his head. Vicky Farrell wasn't the whore she used to be. He'd heard a whisper there was a boyfriend in the wings. A Tony somebody. Tony must be desperate. What kind of man got seriously involved with a tart? You know, Vicky, I can remember a time you'd have had his legs broken and left him in the street without even telling me. You're losing it. Maybe I need to give your job to somebody else. Now show me this idiot. Let's hear what fantasy his father's been feeding him. At the door, he turned. I'm serious. Do better or get another gig. Kelvin Hunter raised his head when Rafferty came in. Vicky had been right about this guy. He wasn't afraid. Sean pegged him somewhere between 20 and 25, as confident a bastard as he'd met in a while. Kelvin sat in a chair in the middle of the room, examining his fingernails, making a show of being bored. His shirt had blood on it, but it wasn't his own. Apart from bruising across his knuckles, he was unmarked. Rafferty caught the amusement in the eyes staring up at him and wanted to waste the young sadist's face. Clearly, Kelvin believed he was fireproof. His father had a lot to answer for. Two men Sean recognised stood behind Hunter. He'd made a run for it once. It wouldn't happen again. Kelvin clapped his hands and spoke in a privately educated accent. At long last, the boss man cometh. Now can I get out of here? He straightened his jacket in a prelude to leaving and tried to stand. Thick fingers digging into his shoulder forced him back on the chair. He shook his head slowly, as though he didn't understand why he was being treated this way, mumbling an explanation to himself that revealed his sense of superiority. She was a prostitute, for Christ's sake. What's the big deal? Rafferty's interest was in what the thug had said to Vicky, rather than the harm he'd done to a defenceless girl. His tone was conversational. Apparently I work for your father. Who told you that? The question surprised Hunter. What? He did. And this work? What is it? How would I know? Maybe we should ask him. First you owe me for damage to my property. Strong hands dragged Kelvin to his feet and threw him against the wall. For the first time, fear lit his eyes. His misjudged sense of entitlement won. He tried the brazen routine again. You wouldn't dare. My father. The punch to his gut doubled him over, lining him up to catch the full force of Rafferty's knee to his chin. Kelvin dropped to the floor and lay still, barely conscious as Sean Rafferty's foot smashed into him, again and again. You're due a valuable lesson. Then we'll hear what your dad has to say for himself, eh? The bungalow and the neat square of well-tended lawn edged with rose bushes would be considered modest in many parts of the country. In Bear's Den, 6 miles northwest of the city centre, it was beyond most people's reach. One survey put the G61 postcode as the 7th wealthiest in the UK. Posh Glasgow, a world away from the tenements of the East End or the high-rise monstrosities like the now demolished Red Road flats where, on a clear day from the 13th floor, residents could see gangs of junkies shooting up on the banks of Hogganfield Loch. Councillor Bryce Hunter lived here. He'd done all right for a guy who'd left school at 15 without a qualification to his name. The car pulled off the road into the drive. Sean Rafferty got out and walked up the path. Behind him, Kelvin Hunter's feet scraped the gravel. Barely able to stand, he wasn't smiling now. Naked from the waist up, supported on either side by the heavies who'd watched their boss teach him a lesson he richly deserved. He moaned as they dragged him to the door, his pale skin black and blue from the beating. Rafferty pressed the doorbell and waited. When it opened, Bryce Hunter saw the gangster and the state his son was in. The elected member's tone told Sean everything. Kelvin was his father's boy. No doubt about that. You low-life bastard, Rafferty. What the hell have you done to him? Think yourself lucky he isn't floating face down in the Clyde. Kelvin here likes rough sex. Did he get that from you or his mother? The problem is, it costs, and he didn't fancy paying for it. A woman appeared from the kitchen, still holding the tea towel she'd been using to dry dishes. Hunter raised his arms to stop her getting closer. It's okay, Hazel. It's okay. Her hand went to her mouth when she saw her boy. Oh my God! Oh my God, what's happened? Hunter shepherded her into the lounge. There's been a bit of trouble, but I'm dealing with it. Kelvin's all right. They dumped the semi-conscious thug inside the door. Rafferty said, Because of this piece of shit, one of my girls is in hospital. He shook his head. Messing with Sean Rafferty's property. How did he imagine it would turn out? Bryce Hunter bent over Kelvin, whispering to him. From the other room, his wife shouted, I'm calling the police. Sean Rafferty ignored her. You'll be getting a bill for lost income. I'll add on something for the girl. He pointed to Kelvin. If you're wise, you'll keep him on a leash. We've got his shirt and jacket. The hooker's blood is on them and there's a video of him admitting he assaulted her. I own you now, Bryce. Don't forget it. Whenever a request for planning permission comes across your desk with my name on it, persuade your colleagues to approve it without the usual malarkey. He moved away, then turned back. One more thing. Kelvin tells me I work for you. Who the fuck gave him that idea? Walking into NYB was like walking into a Jack Vetriano painting. All that was missing was a singing butler. For years, this had been a familiar scene when my office was a room above the diner. Moving from New York Blue might have meant seeing a lot less of Jackie, Andrew and Pat Logue. But like so many things, it didn't come out like that. The space Alex Gilby offered me was round the corner, and whenever I went back to NYB, it was like visiting the land time forgot. Jackie Mellon still managed the place from her cupboard under the stairs. With me gone from the office she'd lusted after, the need to actually occupy it seemed to have passed. Over next to the Rockola, Andrew Geddes was starting his day with his usual habit of ruining perfectly good bagels by dunking them in his coffee. Andrew was a detective sergeant in Police Scotland CID, a shrewd, observant, old-time copper. We'd been friends a long time. More impressive than it sounded because Geddes wasn't the easiest guy to be friends with. He'd helped me more often than I could remember. He had a good heart. But if you wanted to find it, you had to be prepared to dig. And Patrick Logue was Patrick Logue, as permanent a fixture at the bar as Sir Walter Scott on top of the column in George Square. He'd worked for me on and off for years, and was streetwise and savvy, except when it came to his own business. He was a good guy. I liked him. At a minute to 11 o'clock, he broke from the racing section of the Daily Record, and his ritual of picking losers to speak to Jackie. How long till I can get something stronger than a coffee? Asking for an alky. She gave him an old-fashioned look, and poured his first pint of the day. The first of many. I saw her the moment she came through the door. Her lemon dress and Ray-Ban sunglasses pushed up into her blonde hair, perfect for the fine weather central Scotland had been enjoying for more than a week, catching the attention of everyone in the bar, including the women, especially the women. The new arrival scanned the tables, searching for somebody. When she didn't find them, she spoke to Jackie Mallon. Jackie raised an arm and pointed in my direction. High heels clacked on the floor. The vision weaved towards me between the chairs. Then I realised who she was and wished she wasn't coming to me. Close up, with her slim figure and fresh complexion, she might have been 17 or 18. And if she was wearing makeup on her heart-shaped face, it didn't show. We'd never met, though I knew her story. Kim had been a model at the beginning of what was certain to be a successful career. A finalist in the Miss Scotland competition at the Radisson Blue Hotel in Argyle Street the night the man she'd go on to marry introduced himself. Sean Rafferty was the son of legendary Glasgow gangster Jimmy. When his father died, he'd taken over and, on the surface at least, moved away from his family's criminal past. But, behind the facade of respectability, Sean was worse than Jimmy had ever been. For months, pictures of the fairy tale romance between Beauty and the Beast had filled the celebrity gossip columns, coming out of a Michelin-starred restaurant in Edinburgh glassy-eyed, smiling champagne smiles, draped round each other laughing at a Kevin Bridges show in the SEC, strolling barefoot on a Caribbean beach, hand in hand as a blood-red sun dipped into the sea. For me, at least, the last photograph I'd seen of this beautiful woman had been in a chest of drawers in a cottage on the outskirts of Peebles. Her top lip quivered. She was nervous, and not because every pair of eyes was on her. A lady like her was used to that kind of attention and took it in her stride. This was something else. Mr. Cameron? Charlie Cameron? I wanted to deny it. Yeah, that's me. Can I sit down? Please do. I'm sorry to break into your morning. You have an office here, don't you? She was almost correct. I'd had an office here. Now my name was stencilled on the door of a shoebox round the corner in Cochrane Street. I'd gone down in the world, a circumstance I was still coming to terms with. Do you know who I am? Yes. Then you know who my husband is. I knew only too well. Our paths had crossed more than once, and I was fortunate to still be alive to tell the tale. The problem wasn't that I knew Sean Rafferty. It was that Sean Rafferty knew me. Like his father before him, Rafferty was a killer. This lady had known his reputation and married him anyway. What did that say about her? I answered her with a question, suspicion undisguised in my voice. Why are you here, Mrs. Rafferty? She gazed away, as though what she had to say wasn't easy. I'm in trouble. You're the only one who can help. A tear brimmed in her right eye. She blinked, and it cascaded down her cheek. The left eye was closed and swollen, purple and dark where the blow had connected. Painful, though it wasn't why she was crying. I take it he did that. She nodded. My advice would be to go to the police. I can put you in touch. Kim cut across me, her voice louder than she intended. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think that hadn't occurred to me? Her fingers gripped the edge of the table. How long do you imagine I'd survive? He'd kill me and take Rosie. He will anyway, it's only a matter of time. People turned in our direction, instantly interested. At the bar, Pat Logue was one of them, shaking his head. He'd recognised my visitor and was warning me against having anything to do with her. I said, Here isn't the place to be discussing this. We'll go to my office. It's not far. I'm desperate, Mr. Cameron. You don't know how desperate. Chapter 3. We walked to Cochrane Street in silence. As soon as the door of my office closed, she took up where she'd left off, describing the sad reality behind the tabloid fantasy. The marriage was over almost from the beginning. He didn't love me. He used me to clean up his image. On our honeymoon, I caught him with one of the hotel's chambermaids. He wasn't sorry. He laughed, told me to get used to it. Yet he's jealous, insanely jealous. He sees me as his property. Another man only has to look at me and he goes crazy, while he flaunts his affairs and his whores. Kim looked around the modest room, too wrapped up in her own problems to see its shortcomings. He'll never let me go because I take Rosie. Sean idolizes his daughter. She's probably the only person in the world he truly cares about. I spoke quietly, trying to keep disbelief out of my voice. Am I understanding this? You're asking me to help you leave your husband? Finding people who've disappeared is what you do, isn't it? Like that child, baby Lily Hamilton. That was you. It was, but that was very different. Kim sailed through my objections. Wherever I go, wherever I run to, Sean will come after me. She paused and smiled a half smile. As for the police, let's just say, your faith in them is misplaced. She laid her crazy idea on me. I want you to work in reverse. Make me and Rosie disappear. The look in my face should have told her all she needed to know. Even if I was foolish enough to get involved, her plan was doomed. Rafferty had eyes and ears on every street corner in Glasgow and connections far beyond. She reached across and squeezed my fingers. Hers felt soft and dry. You are going to help me, aren't you? At least tell me you'll think about it, so you'll consider it. For God's sake, give me something to cling to. This is my life we're talking about. Mine and my daughter's. Mrs. Rafferty. Don't call me that. Okay, but really. Her hand slipped into her bag and came out clutching a thick bundle held together by a rubber band. The notes were Bank of Scotland 20s, purple like her eye, thousands of pounds. She put them on the table and pushed them towards me. I said, Look, it's not about money. Kim's expression changed, her head tilted, lips parting provocatively. I realized what was coming and tried to stop her before her humiliation was complete. Too late. She whispered, I'll do anything. Anything. Please, Mr. Cameron. Please, Charlie. I felt an overwhelming sadness deep inside me. What she was asking was impossible, even if I was the man for it, which I wasn't. The decision was simple. A choice between prudent or rash, smart or dumb. From bitter experience, I understood the reach Sean Rafferty had and the lengths he'd go to avenge himself on whoever had been stupid enough to help his wife escape. A stone-cold no-brainer. Until a voice that sounded like my voice betrayed my desire to go on breathing. Let me think about it. And I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Kim Rafferty seized on my lack of fortitude. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I was sure you wouldn't refuse me. Hold on. I'm agreeing to give it some thought. Don't read any more into it. She lied. I won't. I promise I won't. I didn't believe her. Give me your mobile number. I added it to my contact list. Her face lit up. You can't imagine how much this means. You've given me hope there's an end to the nightmare. The conversation had gone away from me. I made an attempt to rein it back. Please understand how difficult life will be for you and your daughter if by some miracle we get you away from him. I was talking to myself. She wasn't listening. How soon will you let me know? My throat was dry. Somehow thinking about it had become agreeing to do it. A few days. She threw her arms round me and I smelled her scent. Beautiful, like the lady herself. What the hell had I got myself into? Out in Cochrane Street, Sean Rafferty's wife waved and hurried towards George Square, already dreaming dreams of freedom. I envied her optimism and wished I shared it. As a base, the room in Cochrane Street was okay rather than great. Kim Rafferty had had too much on her mind to notice the Spartan decor. Somebody less rattled might conclude whoever worked here wasn't very good at what they did and find another private investigator to take on their case. I wouldn't blame them. Kim was terrified. It was in her eyes and in her voice, and, though my instinct was to help her, the downside was massive. Getting involved with the wife of the most dangerous gangster in Glasgow was madness, unless I wanted to spend the rest of my life in a wheelchair wishing he'd finished the job. Turning Kim away was the only thing that made sense. Instead, I'd asked for a few days to think about it and given her false hope. Footsteps on the stairs told me I had another visitor. The door banged open, and Pat Logue stood in the frame, his face taut with anger. Before he spoke, I knew what he would say. Patrick had come charging over the hill like the cavalry, and saved me on more than a few occasions. He rarely lost his temper. Today, anger flushed his neck, and his usual bonhomie was missing. He sat in the same chair as Kim Rafferty, the only other chair in the room, and stared at me as though he didn't understand what he was seeing. He was wearing his on-holiday clothes, polo shirt, jeans, and open-toed sandals, the goatee on his chin neatly trimmed. Patrick had a singular view of life and made me laugh. He hadn't come to joke. "How long have we known each other, Charlie? I mean, seriously, how long?" I sighed. "A long time, Pat." "And how often have I given you duff advice?" He didn't wait for a reply. "What I'm getting at is this. A wise man sees trouble and gives it a body swerve. He doesn't seek it out." "I haven't taken her case." He stabbed a knowing finger at me. "That the same as sending her on her way? 'Cause the smile on her face when she left makes me think it isn't." My silence said it all. "For Christ's sake, when will you learn? Whatever Sean Rafferty's wife wants, the answer is no. It has to be. She's bad news. The fact she even came to you is too close for comfort. Any contact, Patrick." The red on his neck rose to his cheeks. "Rafferty hates you. Have you forgotten? I'd rather slam my tits in a car door than go up against him again." "Pat, listen. You should feel the same." "I haven't said I'll help her." He hammered his fist on the desk and shouted, "Don't insult me, Charlie. Don't fucking do that. I understand you better than anybody in this town. Better than you understand yourself. You haven't said you won't. Find some other maiden in distress to play the knight in shining armour with. Not this lady. Not Sean Rafferty's wife." "Listen." "No, you listen. Another case, a different client, fair enough. I'm here. But there's a line you don't cross. Not recognising that will get you killed, which makes you a man with a death wish or a bloody fool. Either way, I'm out. Commit suicide if you want. I'm having no part of it." He pushed the chair back and turned at the door. "Never thought I'd say this, but you're on your own, Charlie." The outburst was so untypical of Patrick Logue, it forced me to reconsider what I'd said to Kim Rafferty. Being married to Sean wouldn't be easy. She'd probably gone into the relationship believing he'd change. Discovering that underneath the promises of everlasting love made in the middle of the night lay a heartless bastard must have been a surprise, expecting him to treat her differently from the rest of the world an error she was paying for. Tossing a child into the mix added a complication other people managed to work round. Sean Rafferty wasn't other people. And Pat Logue wasn't wrong about how the gangster felt about me. Disappointing a woman wasn't a novel experience for me. But Kim Rafferty would need to get by without my help. Back in NYB, the first of the lunchtime crowd were arriving from the salt mines. Pat kept his nose buried in his newspaper and ignored me. Jackie poured the takeaway I'd asked for, black with the 2 sugars, and smiled slyly. Aren't you a dark horse? Am I? Have to say I'm surprised. Why is that? She paused, considering how hard to twist the knife. Without putting too fine a point on it, Charlie, it's fair to say she's not exactly your type. I wasn't aware I had a type. She made a noise in her throat. You amaze me. You really do. Of course you have. Everybody does. What's mine? She handed me the cup and took my money. You usually like them smart, and she's, well, blonde. I'd noticed. Joking aside, it's about time. She's gone home to Malawi and isn't coming back. Get over her. She was talking about Alile, my last girlfriend. Another great woman I'd let slip away. She'd wanted more than I had to give and gone back home to Malawi. I missed her. Though I was reluctant to admit it, Jackie was right. Not for the first time, I'd let something fine slip through my fingers. She isn't my girlfriend. Then who is she? And what did she want? I kept her waiting. The only victory I was getting this morning. If I told you, you wouldn't believe me, Jackie. Chapter 4. You look different. Prison did that to a man, and it had done to Dennis Boyd. His hair was grey, and he'd grown a beard. He raised his face to the sky, for the first time in 15 years, breathing air free from the sweat of 1,000 captive bodies. It felt good. He'd been 37, still relatively young when they'd brought him handcuffed and flanked by 2 officers to Barlinnie, the Victorian building in the East End of Glasgow, almost as famous as Alcatraz. On a cold October morning, Boyd had stepped down from the police van and gazed without emotion at the walls, aware the guards were watching for even the smallest shadow of fear to darken his brow. They'd be disappointed. He was everything they'd heard and more. A hard man from an old school. In court, Boyd pleaded not guilty to the charge and, before sentencing him for the callous murder of Joe Franks, Lord Justice Conor McGuinness asked if there was anything he wished to say. The question went unanswered, and he was taken down. Now, at 52, his skin was the colour of the Bar L's accommodation halls. 2 guards walked with him as far as the main door. Down the pub, is it, Dennis? No. He let the screws draw their own conclusions. A minute of her life she's never going to get back, eh? A minute the first time, maybe. The guards shook their heads and shared a dirty laugh. What about your drawings? Not taking them with you? He patted the leather portfolio. Of course I am. Worth a fortune someday. Someday. He'd got through 15 years dreaming of someday. Now, that day was here. As he stood on the pavement, the murmur of traffic on the nearby M8 reminded him his old stomping ground was just miles away. It would have changed. Boyd let his eyes adjust to the light and wondered why his sister wasn't here to meet him. That wasn't like Annie, his sole visitor during his time in the big house. Once a month, regular as clockwork, she'd come to see him. In the beginning, fired with outrage over the injustice of his conviction, gushing nonsense about appeals until reality arrived, and resignation to the inevitable took hold. Boyd had already been there, day after day in the dock, listening to the prosecution argue the case against him. He'd known it would end exactly the way whoever set him up meant it to. And it had, ably abetted by the inexperienced lawyer appointed to defend him. A car racing down Lee Avenue got his attention. It braked hard alongside him. From behind the wheel, a female wearing oversized sunglasses, a headscarf, and a double strand of pearls over a blue silk shirt spoke in a husky voice through the open window. "Get in." Boyd didn't move. He was done with being told what to do and when to do it. She tossed the cigarette she was smoking at his feet and followed its progress to the gutter. "Your sister isn't coming. Get in." They drove towards Cumbernauld Road and the city. When the lights at Alexandra Parade brought them to a halt, she held out slender fingers painted to match her lipstick and smiled. "Welcome back, Dennis." He still had no idea who she was and didn't respond. Her shades made it impossible to tell. Her exasperation was genuine. "Oh, come on, Boyd. Surely I haven't changed that much, have I?" She swept the glasses away and studied his face for the reaction she was determined to have, knowing the last person he'd expected to be waiting for him was the wife of the man he'd been convicted of killing. "Diane?" "The very same." The lines at the corners of her mouth were new, and her hair was blonde and short, where in the past it had been brunette and fallen, long and straight, to perfect breasts. But the eyes remained the same. At night, in the early years, alone in the darkness of his cell, he'd conjured them, and they'd appeared. Sometimes grey, sometimes green. Eyes that had lied for him and to him. "For God's sake, say something." "Can't. What the fuck, Diane?" They'd been friends, once. She hadn't come to see him because the doubt in her mind would always be there. It would never go away. The jury hadn't shared it. "Where's Annie?" "Told her I needed to speak to you. You'll see her soon enough." "Why are you here?" The question didn't go down well with her. The fingers were withdrawn. He caught the sparkle of a ring on her right hand. Diamonds. What else? Diane feigned disappointment. "You certainly know how to make a girl feel welcome." "That isn't what I meant." Her next statement took him by surprise. "Just for the record, I never believed you did it." A decade and a half too late to do him any good. "Glad to hear it." His expression gave nothing. He'd done his stretch. It didn't matter what she believed, what any of them believed. 15 years had been taken from him. Nothing could bring them back. She shifted in her seat, and her skirt rose up, just as she intended. He ignored it and gazed out of the window at the city. "Stop somewhere for a quick one, will you?" "I'll have you know I'm a happily married woman." He felt himself stir and turned away. "I meant a quick drink." "Where? Most of your old haunts are gone." "Then surprise me." The world he'd known no longer existed. That was something he was going to have to get used to. Diane grinned, tapped a Benson's from a packet, and passed it over. "So, how does it feel?" "How does what feel?" "To be free." "Is that what I am?" "To get your life back." "I'll tell you when it happens. Give me a tour." "Anywhere special you want to see?" Dennis Boyd shook his head. "Just drive." They went west as far as Anniesland Cross and back through the city centre, down Renfield Street, across the river and south. Boyd recognised little of it. It had been too long. After a while, he stopped trying. Occasionally, she pointed to where a building had been and told him the history. He wasn't listening. Almost an hour later, they parked outside a pub on Paisley Road West. "What do you make of it so far?" He grunted. "Not much. Could be anywhere." Inside, she ordered Johnny Walker Black Label for both of them. Large ones. Boyd watched the barman ring up the sale. "Fucking hell. Drinking isn't cheap, is it?" "Nothing is, Dennis. You're about to find out? They sat at a table. He nodded at her glass. Early for you to be starting on the hard stuff. Her reply was tart. How would you know? And she was right. After so much time, what did he know about her? Their affair had been passionate. Maybe the most passionate Boyd had ever had. The first afternoon in particular stood out in his memory. Joe was in Amsterdam on business. They had sex upstairs in his house.